At this point, we will begin the first of our 5 panels. To introduce our first panel entitled Muscling the Economy, Filling the Infrastructure Gap, we have with us the President of the Australia-New Zealand Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. Tom Greeley.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, and thank you, Secretary Pernia, for that fabulous presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this session with our distinguished speaker and distinguished panel. Our first panel is Muscling the Economy by Filling Infrastructure Gaps. As Philippines businesses and residents of the Philippines, we all understand the importance and need for better infrastructure. We're delighted that the administration's 10-point plan includes increasing annual infrastructure spending to account for 5% of GDP, with public-private partnerships playing a key role. The Philippines economy needs more infrastructure muscle to grow, not just today, but in the future. Addressing on infrastructure and the Build, Build, Build program is one of the country's leading economists and Secretary of the Department of Management and Budget. Secretary Diokno has held appointments to the Department of Management and Budget under 3 presidents. I don't think anyone has served longer at the top of DBM than Dr. Diokno. Following the Secretary will be a panel discussion with the Secretary, our moderator, and 6 experts from different areas of the infrastructure community. Secretary Diokno, may I invite you to the stage?
To the officers and members of the various business chambers, my colleagues in government, investors, and esteemed guests, members of the press, good morning. I have the honor of presenting to you today the progress that the Duterte administration has made in fulfilling our 10-point socioeconomic agenda. A huge part of this agenda is anchored on the most ambitious and boldest infrastructure program in recent Philippine history, which we fondly call Build, Build, Build. The compelling argument to invest in public infrastructure now is shared by academicians, policymakers, and business leaders alike. Closing the infrastructure gap will unleash economic productivity and attract foreign direct investments. Upgraded infrastructure will ease the traffic crisis, reduce transaction costs, and provide huge benefits to the Philippine economy and its people. Simply put, a modern and comprehensive infrastructure network is a key driver for inclusive economic growth. Put differently, past underinvestment in infrastructure explains why we have the poorest roads, bridges, urban transit systems, and railways in this part of the world. Now, the Duterte administration will be different. We envision that by the time we step down in 2022, we would have ushered in the golden age of infrastructure in the Philippines, an era that Filipinos will look back with fondness as one that laid the necessary foundations for robust, equitable growth in the long term. The present poor state of infrastructure reflects decades of neglect and misallocation of public resources. We did not just find ourselves with horrendous traffic jams and cramped trains in a few years or so. According to DBM numbers, infrastructure spending as share of gross domestic product averaged less than 2% from 1986 to 2016. The sad reality is that if the numbers were stretched over the past 50 years, the infrastructure as percent of GDP has averaged less than 3%, 2.6% to be precise. This means that while our neighbors were investing heavily in infrastructure to bring about rapid industrialization and growth, the Philippines continued to underinvest, which allowed the existing infrastructure to deteriorate to its current poor state. According to multilateral institutions, the suggested ratio for infrastructure spending as a share of GDP is in the neighborhood of 5% for developing countries. The Philippines barely reached half of that threshold during the last 50 years. This is why we have identified infrastructure development as a priority of the Duterte administration. We have to close the infrastructure gap soon if we are to realize our development objectives of becoming an upper middle income country by 2022 and reduce poverty rate to 14%. As a test of our resolve to close the infrastructure gap, we are targeting as a minimum 5% of GDP for infrastructure financing in the medium term. For 2017, we allocated 5.4% of GDP to infrastructure development. And for 2018, next year, we will allocate 6.3% of GDP to infrastructure. In nominal terms, these figures translate to 858 billion and 1.1 trillion for fiscal years 2017 and 2018, respectively. To put things in perspective, 10 years ago, the national budget was 1.1 trillion. In effect, the 1.1 trillion proposed next year is just equal to the entire budget of the government 10 years ago. Of course, you have to factor in inflation, but nevertheless, you will agree with me, the rise in infrastructure spending is mind-boggling. And that's the job of DOTR and DPWH. Okay. We plan to spend, here's another number, 8 to 9 trillion, or approximately 160 to 180 billion dollars in the next 6 years. As a share of GDP, infrastructure spending will be ramped up from 5.4 as a percent of GDP in 2017 to 7.3% of GDP by 2022. Remember the numbers before? For the last 50 years, 2.6. We are ramping it up to 7.3% of GDP by 2022. Now you see why this is easily the boldest infrastructure program in recent Philippine history. Now the question, how do we plan to finance this bold infrastructure program? Well, we plan to finance this through our expansionary fiscal policy. First, we increase the planned deficit from 2 to 3% of GDP. Second, we plan to reform the outdated, uncompetitive, inequitable, and complicated tax system. And once implemented, the tax policy and tax administration reforms should result to improve revenue effort. Combining the two measures, the government would generate an additional fiscal space amounting to 309 billion next year and rising up to 524 billion or half a trillion in 2022. But we won't be happy with simply expanding our revenue generation possibility. We will also institute reforms to ensure that the huge funds are translated into concrete output. Government underspending, which is the difference between program and actual disbursements has always been a problem of past administrations, and it has been the Waterloo of the previous administration. And we understand how there might be some apprehensions still. While underspending is a valid concern, I would like to argue that they do not necessarily apply to us. For one, last year's spending patterns show significant improvement. Underspending has narrowed to 3.6% of the CAS budget, driven by strong spending for infrastructure and other capital outlays. This is significantly lower than the 13.3% and 12.8% deviations observed in 2014 and 2015, respectively. And take note that we only took over in the second half of 2016. This year, it is even better, as underspending has narrowed to 0.4%, or just 5.9 billion for the first half of the year. This only shows that we have made great progress in improving the way we utilize public resources. Now, specific to capital spending, infrastructure and other capital outlays are also up by 25% for the month of July this year compared to last year. The January to July figures also show that infrastructure and other capital outlays have increased by 11.1% from the comparable period in 2016, 11.1%. And remember, 2016 was an election year when government spending is usually high. Clearly, the infrastructure push of the Duterte administration is gaining steam. This is encouraging news. Infrastructure spending usually follows an S-curve pattern. It starts slow as the new administration experiences adjustment issues, grows exponentially midway through as the government hits its stride, and eventually levels off towards the end of the term. This means you can expect infrastructure spending to gain more traction as we implement major projects as early as 2018. Now, allow me to give you an idea of how we managed to reverse the pattern of underspending in a matter of 1 year. For one, the President vetoed an item in the 2017 General Appropriations Act which states that appropriations must be obligated within a period of 2 years. By vetoing that, in effect, we reduced the validity of the appropriations to 1 year, not 2 years. This is a marked departure from the past practice where appropriations have a 2-year validity period, a setup that predictably led to delays in public service delivery as bureaucrats became complacent with a 2-year validity. While we now operate on a 1-year validity of appropriations, we want to have this institutionalized soon through the budget reform bill, which was certified by the President as urgent also in his State of the Nation address. This mandates a 1-year CAS appropriation budget. This reform proposal will further improve budget utilization in future years, as it will not only limit the validity to 1 year, but will also mandate a CAS-based budget. Obligations are intentions, not actual expenditures. So we must shift to CAS-based public financial system. And the passage of the budget reform bill, which incidentally is moving along in both houses of Congress, will speed up the completion of infrastructure projects and other programs of the government. We also believe that the line agencies have benefited from the revised implementing rules and regulations of the government procurement reform law, which took effect on October 2016. The new IRR has quickened the procurement process, made it less vulnerable to arbitrary delays, and streamlined the documentary requirements without sacrificing the integrity of public procurement. It is indeed unfortunate that in the past, The procurement law has been made a scapegoat by incompetent and corrupt civil servants. 9184, Republic Act 9184, is an internationally lauded law which balances transparency, accountability, and procurement efficiency. The system worked well only if bureaucrats will stop gaming the system and start implementing the law properly. For infrastructure in particular, we will push for 24/7 non-stop construction, enforce stronger project monitoring through technology, and embrace the hybrid PPP approach for the swift rollout of projects. Allow me to focus on why we prefer hybrid PPP, and then I will leave the implementation reforms to the capable hands of the DPWH and the DOTR representatives. What is the so-called hybrid PPP modality? Well, it is largely demand-driven. The government chooses the project that it deems appropriate. Next, it arranges the financing, either through the budget, ODA financing, or through foreign loans. It then bids out the project, again to be done by the private sector, either local contractors, foreign contractors, or both. And then after the project is built, the government then will turn around and bid out the operations and maintenance of the project to the private sector. This is akin to the SCTEX model or the MWSS concessionaire model. There are two reasons why we prefer this modality. First, it will make sure that the projects will be completed earlier. Second, the project will be more affordable as the government can borrow at a lower cost and need not impute a return on investment. On the first reason, studies show that using PPP, it takes 29 months from project ID to groundbreaking, 29 months. We cannot afford such delay. Most of our projects, with few exceptions, are envisioned to be completed during the term of President Duterte. We do not want half-finished projects by the time the President steps down. On the second reason, the government can borrow at a much lower rate and for a far longer period. For example, for the Metro Subway project, we can borrow at 0.1% interest. That's 1/10 of 1% for 40 years, including the grace period. Now let me ask you, which private firm can borrow at such concessional rates? I assure you, however, that the private sector will not be crowded out with this hybrid PPP setup. It's still the private sector who will be asked to construct the projects through competitive bidding. Moreover, after the project is completed, the operations and maintenance will be auctioned off to the private sector, enabling market participation from private firms. Now, in addition, we are now open to unsolicited proposals, subject to Swiss silence. The previous administration wasn't open to unsolicited proposals. There's another thing. We won't use PPP as a way to raise revenues for the government. That is, by awarding the PPP project to whoever can give the highest premium. That's taxation without representation. That's unfair to the users of the public facility, since the user charge will be higher than the cost of the project. Now, on top of this policy and administrative reforms, the President has made it clear again and again that he will not tolerate incompetence. His directive to his cabinet members is simple: use it or lose it. Use your budget, use it well, or lose your job. He does not and will not tolerate unnecessary delays in the delivery of essential public services. So in brief, our citizens may expect the President's trademark political will and implementation efficiency with regards to the Build, Build, Build program. In conclusion, the Duterte administration is serious in its pursuit for real change. All our efforts are geared towards sustaining the economy's growth momentum and improving the lives of Filipinos. The Build, Build, Build program is not only about upgrading our infrastructure. It is not only about providing decent jobs and attracting investments. It is also about linking the present with our vision of a prosperous Philippines, a stronger economy with higher standards of living, a harmonious society with effective and accountable governance, and a country that we all can be proud of. Admittedly, the road from the present to our vision of the future is a process with growing pains and bumps along the way. It will not be easy, and we cannot do it alone. So please join us in this difficult yet surely worthwhile journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Diokno. May we request you to stay on stage to join the panel discussion. To moderate this esteemed panel, may we call on stage the host of What's the Big Idea on Rappler, former ANC Business News Head and former Bloomberg News Bureau Chief, Mr. Coco Alcuaz. We'd also like to call on the panelists representing the various infrastructure areas to join him on stage. Representing water is the former chairman of the Metropolitan Waterworks and Sewerage System and former executive director of National Water Resources Board, Mr. Ramon Alikpala. Representing roads is the Undersecretary for Planning and PPP of the Department of Public Works and Highways, the Honorable Dr. Catalina E. Cabral. Representing Rail is Mr. Leo de Velez, the Project Development Officer of the Department of Transportation. Representing airports is the former Undersecretary for Airports of the Department of Transportation, Attorney Roberto C.O. And for ports, we have the Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Cargo Inc., Mr. Michael Raeuber. Finally, representing telecommunications is the Undersecretary for Development and Innovation of the Department of Information and Communications Technology, the Honorable Denis Villorente. Over to you, Mr. Coco Alcuaz.
Good morning. Please have a seat, guys. We have 45 minutes, 44:58. Let me begin by asking Secretary Diokno a question. You talked about how we're going to accelerate the infrastructure program. There was an analysis last week in Business World. I urge you to look at it, I think on September the 6th. And it said that one of the problems you might encounter there is not the financing part, which you talked about very well, but in terms of manpower. It said that you will need 3 million workers to build all this infrastructure. And for the construction companies here and anyone trying to fix their house, I know you know how difficult it is to get even just 2 or 3 carpenters or workers to work there. Where will the labor come from?
Well, luckily, we will not do it all at one time, right? So it's going to be like an S-curve, as I said. And so we have enough time to prepare for that, okay? Every year, I think we turn out something like at least 1.5 million from K-12, right? So first of all, we still have unemployment. So this is the job for TESDA. And we expect some people from the Middle East to come home, our Filipino overseas workers. So I think, and most of the big projects are really labor intensive, are rather capital intensive, like the subway. We don't need a lot of workers there. It's tunneling, it requires a lot less people, okay? So, but I agree, we have to prepare for that eventuality where we may run out of workers which is a good problem. So that means full employment for Filipinos. Higher wages. We have to beat them out. So that it's not only full employment, higher wages for Filipinos. Okay?
Assuming you have the skill to do it.
Yeah, that's why. As I said, we produce something like, remember, we produce something like 2 million babies every year. These are all, so we expect about 1.2 million to join the labor force every year.
We're not supposed to accelerate that.
No, we're not
Population
supposed to
growth
do
rate,
that,
right?
of course.
In the last few days, there's been a lot of news in the papers and on TV about the Mega Manila subway, Undersecretary. The prospect, this is a DOTR's project, right? Yeah. I'll ask the DOTR. When do you expect to start that? And did you consider a more affordable alternative, such as another MRT? Because it is very expensive to build it. And for anybody who experienced the floods of 2 days ago, the joke on social media was, if we can't keep our streets unflooded, how much more a subway?
Let me answer for that, because there's nobody here from DOTR, right? The subway will cost something like $7 billion, or 355 billion pesos. Okay, look, there are new technologies, right? We can build tunnels under the sea, so that's not a problem, right? And Japan is going to do this for us, not Filipinos or other contractors. Okay? So I'm not afraid of the possibility that it will be flooded. Okay, there are new technologies that will make sure that it's not. On the date of start, we expect that to be will be groundbreaking by first quarter of next year, and it will be done over a period of 7-10 years. Okay? That's one of the few projects that we will start and will not be finished under the third administration.
Undersecretary Villorente of DICT, Bill Luce spoke towards the end of his presentation about needing to get all these processes online. I know you are working with some of the other departments on TradeNet, which he spoke about. Could you give us more of an update on how quickly we can do all of these approvals and licenses on our phones?
Well, speaking about TradeNet, this is a collaborative project being implemented by DICT with the Department of Finance, together with the Department of Trade and Industry, and a total of around 66 trade regulatory agencies. The system itself is now under test. This essentially will be the national single window of the Philippines and will be connecting to the ASEAN single window. We are working to bring it into production by December of this year, and that will essentially cut a lot of the time required and the effort required for both filing and getting all of the permits and licenses to bring in, for example, a product from abroad or bring out for export a local product. Because instead of each entity going through agencies of government submitting the same data, the same information for a commodity that he wants to bring in or out, it will be just a single lodgement. And based on the product, the system will know which agency of government or agencies of government are required to issue specific permits or licenses. And in that sense, we hope that that will cut the processing time down to maybe 3 days. It really depends on the specific product, especially if it's regulated. But if it's not regulated, I think it will be almost like within the day.
Before I forget, I was told that there are mics in the audience. So if anybody has any question, please just go to the mic, raise your hand. I'll be looking out once in a while to try to see if anyone is at the mic, so please do that at any time. Michael, for those who don't know, Michael runs one of the bigger and more dynamic logistics companies in the country. Bill Luce also pointed out that one of the areas, in fact the only area I think, where our competitiveness fell, or one of the few areas where competitiveness fell, was in logistics. What has that meant to you, and do you see a light at the end of the tunnel?
What that means to us is both opportunity and problem, because problems are usually opportunities. So of course we are far behind and we have to catch up with our neighbors. And looking at the Philippines being an archipelago, so besides improving the roads on the land side, what desperately needs to be improved is the development of the ports. Now, a lot of progress has been made. I prepared a speech which I don't have time to deliver, 3 pages about all the good things which have happened in the past 3 years, and indeed a lot was done. Arangkada was one of the first ones years ago who pointed to the Batangas to Clark or Subic corridor. Now that corridor is almost completed, save for the SLEX-NLEX connection, and that one is under construction. Well, I can go on and on. So a lot of things have been done. However, on the other side, Philippine domestic shipping is still expensive. Now, if you analyze why, you will easily find out the drivers of cost. And some of the drivers of cost are underdevelopment of the ports. 2 things there. The main ports are not dredged deep enough to accommodate bigger ships. Bigger ships, better economy of scale, cheaper cost, cheaper rates to the public. The other one, if you would observe, all ships in domestic trade are self-geared. If you would enable the ports to handle ungeared ships, cheaper cost to the public again. If you throw in reduction in red tape, bureaucratic regulation, and cost on the taxation side, you would enable the Philippine blue economy to compete with its neighbors. Now, considering that ASEAN is getting closer and closer together, I think it's very important to go down that lane. Thank you.
Bobby Lim, for those who don't know, was the Undersecretary for the Transport Undersecretary in charge of air. He left the government a few months ago. Bobby, could you tell us what were the main improvements there? And as of the time you left, what kinds of improvements we should be seeing in the next few years?
In terms of improvements, well, first the good news, no? I mean, a lot of people have discussed that Clark Airport is an underdeveloped public asset, and the good news is that the horizontal developments there, the funds have been released as early as January. That's about 2 billion pesos. It's ongoing, and then the terminal is being bidded out, the construction on a build and transfer basis by BCDA. There are ongoing discussions between BCDA and the bidders, and the target for the bidding is December. And you can expect the builders to build that within the prescribed time under very stringent preconditions by the government, which is we will simply pay you at the end when you build it. And that would contribute a terminal that can process 8 million passengers. So that is good because that will complement the shortage of capacity in Manila, aside from being a regional airport, to service Luzon and Northern Luzon, which has a catch basin of about 20 million passengers. Now, insofar as Manila is concerned, the policies that have been implemented, it's a combination of policy and procedures. One would, of course, be requiring Gen Av to only operate or not to operate between 12 o'clock in the afternoon until 7 in the evening. Gen Av only, they occupy space and time for very scarce resources, and this would best be used by commercial aviation. No? The effort to move general aviation outside of Manila, however, is taking more time. It is quite disruptive to the small businesses and to specialized operators that, let's say, serve the integrated leisure resorts. One strategy, of course, is to encourage them to fly to Clark, to Subic, and Sangli. They are now flying to Sangli, which is just a few kilometers away. Unfortunately, the improvement of the runway of Sangli is delayed. That is a 2.7-kilometer runway. If you are able to refurbish that, then it can absorb more general aviation. And maybe at this point in time, it might be good to say that government, with the cheap funds that are available, should already build the road from the mainland, which is, let's say, Bacoor or one of the cities of Cavite, and connect it already to Sangli, with or without the airports at the moment, because this would be a developmental activity that is a suitable and appropriate project for government in itself. Whether the airport there will develop into simply a Gen Ab complex, whether it will develop into an airport servicing domestic traffic, or whether it will become international, that can come as part two. But the more important thing is to connect Sangli to the mainland so that it can be an option ready depending on what the government wants. Now, when it comes to the NAIA, well, certainly, the design capacity of 31 million has been surpassed by the actual traffic of 39 million in 2016. I think certainly what we have done and what is currently being done is policies, procedures. You have now the rapid exit taxiway being scheduled to be completed by next year. So that should facilitate the speedier use of the runway. The brand new CNS ATM, this is the communication navigation system, will be fully operational by the first quarter of next year. The training is ongoing right now. That would allow for a more efficient use of the airspace. In other words, you can extract more productivity out of every minute, every hour that airspace is used by commercial aviation. So airspace efficiency with this technology in combination with more efficient use of the space on the ground should provide more productivity. However, what you need more clarity, however, in how to develop the open spaces in NAIA. You have a green patch in Terminal 3 that remains undeveloped. You have the Nayong Pilipino Pagcor property beside Terminal 2 that remains undeveloped. There have been proposals from the private sector on an unsolicited basis to develop an annex terminal. I think government should prioritize the negotiation of these proposals because you need more terminal space aside from the runway. Manila remains the gateway for the Philippines. If it is currently impaired, it impairs and impedes our ability to connect domestically and internationally.
Manila is the gateway, but the previous government had a plan to bid out, I think, 3 clusters of provincial airports. And the new government decided to change that plan. I think it plans to bid them out as individual airports, I think. How much interest was there in that project? And do you think it will remain despite the change in format?
Yes, the current format is the hybrid model. And my understanding is that there's a high level of interest in the hybrid model because the constructors, there are 6 or 7 bidders bidding to build the 8 million passenger terminal. There is interest on the part of the private sector to operate and manage this. And I understand the department is also scheduling the bid out of the operation and management. So if that is any indication, together with the formal announcement of government that unsolicited proposals are welcome, then these regional airports should be attractive for local and foreign players. Because the foreign operators can still bid for all three of them on an unsolicited basis. There is no rule prohibiting that at the moment. They can always combine with builders. So it may involve a two-step process rather than an integrated approach. But it is possible to develop these regional airports to catch up with the privatization of these airports. No? Now, to your question earlier, of course, ideally, it would have been better if it was completed, but the point is, it is operating right now, and if government is open to unsolicited proposals, and it looks like the hybrid model is being implemented on a fast-paced basis, then it should be good for the aviation sector. I think the big challenge really is the new Manila International Airport, because there are several big proposals there. And again, government has to come up with a decision earlier than later, because that's a minimum 10-year project. But you need to make decisions now. I mean, you have a proposal in Bulacan, you have a proposal in Sangli. These are really proposals to build cities, because the one in Bulacan involves 2,500 hectares. The one in Sangli, a seaport, logistics center, airport. So I think more than DOTR, NEDA, and the economic cluster team should come up with the criteria to make a selection of either both or one site. But certainly decisions have to be made.
Secretary Diokno, you slightly worried me a while ago when you were speaking here, and you said you don't want projects that will not be completed. You want all the projects to be completed within the term. You've made an exception with the subway. That's not a hard and fast rule, right?
No, that's the general rule. There's a preference by the president to have all the projects that he started to be finished within his term, because you see a lot of unfinished projects. Okay, so that's why he prefers it like that. Okay.
Let me ask Undersecretary Cabral of the DPWH. I had a chance to talk to your boss recently, and he kind of shocked me with the number of bridges he plans to build across Pasig River. Could you tell us a bit about that? And for many of us who don't go out into the countryside so much, what are the most important projects out there?
Thank you. Thank you.
How many bridges will there be
Well,
across
there are
Pasig?
planned 13 bridges across Pasig River, Mangahan Floodway, and Marikina River.
Don't these ask you to repeat
13.
the number? 13.
13 bridges. And actually, 2 bridges were already approved by NEDA board last Monday. So these are going to be Chinese funded. But let me start by saying the Department of Public Works actually is the construction arm of government. And I mentioned earlier was the 1.2 trillion infrastructure program for 2018. The big challenge for DPWH is actually more than 50% of that will be implemented by DPWH. But that said, we're not just focusing on the major flagship projects in the 75 BBB program, but we're also building a lot and planning and building a lot more infrastructure outside the Metro Manila and the National Capital Region. In fact, we've been implementing tourism road projects as well as those leading to trade and industry and economic zones. Much of the focus really is on the mega projects in Metro Manila. But Public Works has planned under the Philippine Development Plan a lot of infrastructure outside, and in fact we're focusing on rural development, particularly in Mindanao, where we have major projects that are lined up in our medium-term development program. You mentioned the 10 bridges in Metro Manila, not 10, actually 13 bridges. Two will be starting already next year, and this are going to be the Pantaleon Estrella Bridge and the Binondo Intramuros Bridge, which are going to be funded through Chinese financing. But that said, we're also doing, for example, we're going to rehabilitate, no? Believe it or not, Guadalupe Bridge. This is actually part of our seismic retrofitting and resiliency program. Guadalupe Bridge, if you're not familiar, is the one along EDSA. And given the traffic that we're already here, we, of course, would apologize for the more traffic that we will create, but that Guadalupe Bridge is already due for rehabilitation because it's already more than 50 years old. We still have a number of projects in Metro Manila. DPWH is in charge of major projects like the connector, the Skyway, the acquisition of the right-of-way for the Skyway project. We are already finishing the detailed design for the NLEX-SLEX connector, as well as starting the construction for the Cavite-Laguna Expressway. Also on our table are several projects unsolicited that we have received from the private sector, and we're evaluating that. And as soon as we're ready to present that to NEDA board, we will submit that, and hopefully that will also be approved early next year for implementation. Again, the challenge really is in making sure that we finish many of these projects under the term of the President.
Undersecretary, the Guadalupe Bridge is what, 8 lanes? Is it 8 lanes or 6 lanes?
Actually, which one?
The Guadalupe Bridge now.
It's actually 6 lanes.
6 lanes.
6 lanes. But
So-
we'll make sure that 3 lanes will be open at any given time.
Good luck, no?
Yes, definitely. It's
Will-
really good. It's
will
really
you-
good luck to all of us.
Will you finish all the other bridges before you start on the Guadalupe Bridge?
No, actually, we have already awarded the Santa Monica Bridge, which we hope to be significantly finished before we start rehabilitating Guadalupe Bridge. I think the target for Guadalupe Bridge would be sometime in 2019, the actual construction. So that means it will give us more time to finish a number of projects in Metro Manila, to be able to use that as an alternative once we start retrofitting and rehabilitating the outside portion of Guadalupe Bridge. But again, we'll make sure that we have at least three lanes open at any given time along Guadalupe Bridge.
Before I ask Dondi a question, allow me to welcome the representative of the Department of Transportation. This is Mr. Leo de Velez. He's the Project Development Officer there at DOTR. So guys, we have about 20 minutes. So if there's any questions, please get up to the mics and I'll call on you. Dondi, at the end of the row, was the MWSS regulator until, was it 2 years ago? 3 years ago. Could you tell us how difficult was it to build the water-related projects, which was being handled by MWSS, not by the regulatory office? But what kinds of difficulties did they have, or challenges did they have, to build the water projects? I mean, a lot of us sometimes hear about how water is going to be one of the big issues 10, 20 years down the road. It's already an issue in the Philippines now. What kinds of problems did they encounter, and what kinds of solutions are on track now?
I mean, in the early years, we're talking about, this started in 1997. The first one was probably labor. You had private companies absorbing government employees. That's a headache in itself. So they had to adjust the culture. I think that was the biggest problem. Second, a lot of the pipes that were, when they bid for the project, they anticipated so many kilometers of pipes, only to find out it was actually 50% more that they had to maintain, so that would have affected a lot of their maintenance operations. But other than that, it hasn't been too difficult because the problem actually is absorbed by the private companies and not so much the government regulatory bodies. The regulators started from zero. They had no background. That was difficult. You had the Asian crisis that came in. which threw everything off because there was no regulatory measure to adjust to that. And then you had typhoons just hit the country. But that's an interesting question, because I just wanted to say what we're actually seeing in the water sector right now is we're seeing the replication of all these PPP projects in the rest of the country. We're seeing it more so in the past 2 years than we've seen in the past 25 years, actually. So, and that's primarily because NEDA came out with new guidelines for joint ventures in 2013. And because of that, it's created now the influx of more private sector participation in the water sector. So you're going to be seeing, Iloilo's going to be privatized or entering, these are all joint venture models. Lemery, San Fernando, we're seeing more than 20, if not close to 30 concessions happening within, probably completed this year or next, and that's going to be a welcome development for the consumers in the provinces.
I know there's a question over here, but before I turn to you, just 1 minute, let me ask Mr. Leo de Velez. He's the Project Development Officer at DOTR. Actually, my first question was for you, but you weren't here yet. The mega subway project. Did you consider, why did we go the subway route when I think most people understand that an elevated train, or maybe even a BRT, but maybe an elevated train in this instance, would be a more affordable solution?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to first extend the apologies of Secretary Togade and Undersecretary Chavez for not being able to meet this forum. So on the question of the subway is really just one of the many transportation backbones that we need in metropolitan Manila. We have other railway projects that are meant to serve the large transportation demand that we have here in the metropolis and also in the greater capital region. We have several projects actually that already that will be addressing this transportation supply problem. We already have the PNR projects, the one going to Clark, the one going to Bicol. The subway forms another one of these transportation backbones from north to south of Manila to really serve almost 1 million passengers per day. So yes, there are other maybe cheaper forms of railways, but those are also being done in parallel to the subway. The subway is meant to complement.
But that alignment that the subway will take, would it have been possible to do parts of that or most of that as an elevated rail, which might have made it more affordable?
Sure. Actually, the subway that was approved recently by NEDA is only the first phase of the Mega Manila subway. And even the first phase of the Mega Manila subway is not fully underground. It is fully underground in the areas that are heavily built up. These are our CBDs in Ortigas, in BGC, and in Taguig. But towards the north of Manila, past North Avenue, the railway alignment is actually going above ground.
So from Project 8 to the Ateneo area, that will be above ground?
Past North Avenue going to Mindanao Avenue.
Okay.
And when we further extend the subway northwards towards Valenzuela, this will be above ground.
Okay, thanks very much. So there's a question I know over here, and I'll stand up so I can see you. Could you introduce yourself and then keep the question short? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And tell us who the question is for, rather.
Yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm James Gregor Asuelo from the Chamber of Commerce of the Philippine Islands. I have a few questions. First question for Secretary Ben Diokno. We've noticed that based on the proposed budget of the government for 2018, the proposed national expenditure points at 3.7 trillion pesos, or 700 billion pesos more from its previous budget of 2016. However, we noticed that based on the data we've gathered, there are several items for underspending under personal services, MOOE, and even on the capital outlays. What your department is planning to improve the underspending of the government, because we know that every moment that each of the agencies underspend this project, then it has detrimental effect to the economy of the country and of course to the development of the countryside. That's a first question. And I have also a second question because somebody made mention about the development of the Clark as an Clark Airport as an alternative transit in Metro Manila. Do we have a status or recent development on the airport project, on the railway project that will connect Metro Manila and the Clark Airport?
I think the answers to those can be relatively brief. So Secretary
Now,
Diokno first.
I want to find out, is what underspending you're talking about, is that previous budget or this year's budget?
The previous budget, sir.
I cannot
For
be, you can't hold me accountable for their underspending.
For the 2016 budget, sir, which of course
That's-
partly form part of the administration
Yeah,
of the
but,
President Duterte.
maybe part of that will be what we call miscellaneous personal benefits fund, which is personal services, or the
Yes.
retirement fund. So maybe not many people retired, or they were under hiring, they were not hiring the right people at the same time. Plus, don't make me accountable for the previous administration.
Your
please.
second question, I think this must have been Bobby who was talking about Clark, but I will ask the incumbent official to answer that question.
Sure. On your point about Clark Airport being developed, one of the critical parts of that development is really the interconnectivity with the metropolitan area in Manila. So this year, actually, in December, we will be groundbreaking the first phase that will get us to Clark from Manila via railway. This railway will connect Manila and Clark in barely under an hour, and the projected capacity of this will be 350 passengers per day. So it is really expected to support the development of Clark International Airport as a new transport hub.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ordonez over here.
Magandang umaga po. Ako po si Ernie Ordonez, Chairman ng Alianza Agricultura, and right now the non-paid Secretary General of the National Water Roadmap and Summit. My question is addressed to Mr. Alikpala, who is probably the best person in water in the country today. We are having a summit with President Duterte in October, and we've had 7 pre-summits in Mindanao, Visayas, Mindanao. My question is simple. There are about 55 recommendations. Mr. Alikpala, if President Duterte were to ask you, what are the 1 or 2 things you think he should do to address this water crisis, which today is killing more people than extrajudicial killings at the rate of 73 people dying every day? Mr. Alikpala, what are the 1 or 2 things you want President Duterte to do?
Can I interrupt? Could you repeat that statistic that you just said? About
Yes.
how many and how are they dying per day?
73 people die every day from water-related diseases, ranging from bad water to floods to typhoons that are uncontrollable, etc. And Mr. Alikpala is an expert in water, and I want him to suggest in front of all of you, what are the 1 or 2 things that President Duterte should announce, because he is leading the National Water Summit next month.
Dondi?
Thanks, Ernie.
Are you involved in the Water Summit?
Yes,
Okay.
you got me pulled in.
Okay.
Oh, first of all, one of the data we always assume that like about half the number of people in the country have access to piped water at home. Well, a study made which was completed 2 years ago, we found out that less than 40% actually have piped water at home, which is why a lot of people are actually drinking unsafe water. And one of the reasons is because most of the water utilities are actually run by LGUs and not water districts, and they're unregulated. And we don't have a proper regulator for the water, for our water service providers. There's no regulator for water supply and sanitation. Actually, there are many regulators, and in the process, a lot of people are not getting properly regulated. So we're pushing for the creation of a water regulatory commission, a WRC, to give licenses and cancel licenses and regulate even publicly run utilities. Second, that's for water and sanitation. Second, we believe that the people who live off their water sources have to manage their own water sources. So we're pushing also for the creation of better river basin management, much like, following an integrated, more holistic, river basin approach, taking into consideration irrigation and hydropower and water supply and other uses. Right now, we only have one river basin organization, really. It's LLDA. And you have 421 river basins. So that's going to be the next step into trying to get our water managed. We actually do have enough water in this country. But I can't bring the water from Bukidnon to Baguio. Baguio doesn't have water, and it's one of the highest rainfalls, but it doesn't have water. It's all a management issue. So we're actually welcoming a lot of the attention being given by the private sector in the water sector in this regard. So those are the two things. Better water management at the resource level and the creation of a water regulatory commission.
Thank you, Mr. Ordonez. There's a question over there.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jason Caraan from the Metro Pacific Investments Corporation. This question is specifically addressed to Secretary Diokno. I guess the question is, when does the government expect the tax reform bill to be passed? And will there be any implications to the golden age of infrastructure if it gets delayed or worse, not passed at all? Thank you.
Well, I'm optimistic that it will be passed sometime in November this year. Okay. So how will it affect? I showed you earlier that it has increased our what's called fiscal space. It will maybe generate additional 200 million on an annual basis. Okay.
All right. Just in case, I mean, we're hopeful and optimistic about it being passed, right? But
it's 90% probability of being passed. Okay, so let's not speculate on what will happen if it's not passed.
all
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
Are there more questions from the floor? If there are none, please join me in thanking our excellent panel this morning. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for all of our panelists and our moderator. Can we have a quick photo, please, at the center of the stage? And while the speakers are having their photos on stage, we encourage everyone to actively participate in the discussions today, especially during the open forum. Should you have questions after the forum, please do send them to forum@arangkadaphilippines.com. We'd also like to invite you to help promote Arangkada in social media by tweeting about the event using the event hashtag Arangkada Forum 2017. We invite you to also like us on Facebook.com/Arangkada Philippines, and to connect with us on LinkedIn by looking for Arangkada Philippines.